What's going on, everybody? This is Pastor Sam. I hope you're doing well. We're going to continue our study on the names of God, and of course, we're doing it via video with everything going on. I'm here at the house, and Brooks is with me. She's working today, so let's just jump right in. I think most of us have probably experienced losing something very precious to us, whether that was a toy when you were young, or maybe it was your first love in high school, or later on, it could have been, the tragic loss of a loved one, or maybe the loss of a job, or anything like that. Or maybe you sold something very important to you in order to get something that you felt maybe a little bit more valuable. And this is where we find Abraham at. Now, if you remember, Abraham has been on a journey of faith for sure. God had called him out of the Ur of the Chaldees, and basically he was a idol worshiping pagan, just like everybody else around him, but God was gracious, promised Abraham that he would bless him, and promised that he would give him descendants as numerous as the stars, and that through him all the earth, all the world would be blessed. And we find that Abraham has tried to be faithful to God. He's certainly made some mistakes, and we see that in one case even he decided to take matters into his own hands by deciding he might make Eliezer his heir rather than the one God had promised. And then later on, he decides, well, maybe I can have a son by Hagar, my wife's handmaiden, and that ended up being Ishmael, but that was not the one God had promised. And then finally, God fulfills his promise, and Isaac is born to Abraham and Sarah. Now, the text we're going to get into out of Genesis chapter 22 is probably, to me, one of the most pivotal texts in all the Bible, and not just in the Bible, but you look at Abraham's life. This is probably at one and the same time a crushing moment, but also a defining moment for Abraham. And it begins like this in chapter 22 of Genesis. It says, and it came to pass after these things. So this is after God had blessed Abraham, after God had fulfilled his promise, and continued to be faithful to Abraham, sometimes despite Abraham's unfaithfulness. It says the Lord tested Abraham, or God tested Abraham, and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountain, one of the mountains, which I shall show you or tell you. And so here Abraham is, and he is about to obey God, and he is pretty immediate in his obedience. The very next morning, Abraham gets up, he and the servants and Isaac, and they head to Moriah. Now, one of the things, I don't know, I got a book I love to read out of. It's A.W. Tozer's Pursuit of God, but here's how A.W. Tozer kind of imagines this scene the night before this is to take place. He says, but respectful imagination may view in all the bent form, wrestling convulsively alone under the stars. Possibly not again until one greater than Abraham wrestled in the Garden of Gethsemane did such mortal pain visit a human soul. So this is just describing probably the internal frustration, the anguish, the questions and doubts that may be surrounding Abraham as he tries to wrestle through this whole thing of going to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. But needless to say, the very next morning, he and Isaac head to Moriah. Now, of course, what happens is on the way to Moriah, Isaac, who at the time is probably in his late 20s, notices that they're missing something. He knows that he and his father are going to offer a sacrifice. He realizes that they are, probably trying to be faithful to what God says, but he begins to question what's really going on here. And he asks his father, he says, Father, we've got wood for the sacrifice, but where is the lamb? We don't have a lamb to sacrifice. And Abraham's response is one that is not only well, if I'm looking at it on the surface, it's one that I think is probably meant to kind of postpone the inevitable, where he's going to eventually have to tell Isaac that he's the sacrifice. But he says, son, the Lord will provide for himself a lamb for the sacrifice. So keep that in mind. This is kind of the basis of this entire story. And so what happens is they finally get up to where they're going, and Abraham looks to the servants and he says, "You stay here with the donkeys. The lad and I think some translations say, but the young man and I will head towards the mountain which God has shown me." And so they do, and he puts the wood on Isaac's back, and that's when the question is asked, and so they finally get to the where they're going, and they're going to offer the sacrifice. And so here Isaac is discovering that he is now the sacrifice. And this in and of itself, we kind of commend Abraham for being obedient to God, but at the same time, there's this part of me that's like, really, Abraham, would you really think God would ask you to do that? And so this must have been some sort of majorly tangible experience that Abraham had to be able to obey to this point. But the other thing is not just commending Abraham's faithfulness, but also Isaac. Isaac is willing to be sacrificed. And Hebrews kind of clarifies what's going on here, because you look back and Abraham has been faithful and he has seen God do the impossible. He saw God take he and his wife Sarah, who were barren, who were without children. They were 100 and she was 90 years old, and God gave life to them and laughter, because that's what Isaac's name means, laughter. And he saw that God could do what seemed to be impossible. And Hebrews actually points this out, that Abraham went through with this believing that God was able even to raise Isaac from the dead. And so he was believing that they were going to go up to that mountain and that God would raise Isaac from the dead once the sacrifice was given, because he had already took a dead womb in his wife Sarah and made it alive. And so this is where we are. And as Abraham, and most of you know the story, he begins to raise the knife. And as he begins to come down, the angel, the messenger, the sent one from the Lord stops him and says, "Don't touch him. I know that you fear God." And so one of the things I see in this story is Abraham's unflinching, and Isaac as well, their unflinching obedience, even without fully understanding what God is trying to do. And of course, the ram is found in the thicket, caught in the horns right after that. Now, what happens is that Abraham and Isaac, I'm sure, rejoicing at what God had just done, go and get the ram, and they offer the ram as a burnt offering. Well, if you notice, going back to the phrase I told you to remember earlier, it says where Abraham responds to Isaac, he says, "Where is the lamb?" Or Isaac says, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham says in verse 8 of chapter 22, God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering. Now, that ram was not the fulfillment of what Abraham had to say. So I wrote a couple of things down. But once they offer, and we'll get to that in a minute, but once they offer the lamb, or the ram, Abraham names the place Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord sees beforehand, or in some translations, the Lord will provide. And what we see here is that God is sufficient. A couple of things we notice is, too, that it wasn't a lamb they offered. And I don't think Abraham was speaking when he said a lamb. Now, he may have been not knowing what he was talking about, but I think, prophetically, even not knowing it, he was saying that the Lord would provide for himself the lamb, a lamb for the sacrifice. And ultimately, he was pointing to Jesus Christ. But let's continue on. We'll get to more of that in a minute. And so they provide the sacrifice. Abraham names it Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Couple of things I want us to bring out of this story. First of all, if we are to experience God as provider, one of the things we need to be able to do is we need to learn to be obedient to God. Even sometimes when it is contradictory, especially when it's contradictory to our nature and our inclination. I'm not saying throw common sense out the window, but there are sometimes, the Bible says the heart is desperately wicked. And there are some times where we want something so bad that we're willing to go against what God would have for us, and sometimes God's commands. And God has declared that he would show himself as a provider for us if we will be obedient to him, especially sometimes when it goes against the desires of the flesh. And so there's a couple of questions I want to ask you is, what is it that you are hesitant to do? Maybe you feel like God's calling you to do something, but you're hesitant to do it. You think, well, maybe I'm not good enough to do this. I'm not as morally upright as I need to be, or maybe I don't quite have the learning that I need to have, or the education I need to have to really do this. There are some of us, God has called us to do something, and we've not really stepped out on that, and at least started in the direction of what God's called us to do. God has promised that if we will step out on faith, that he will be a provider. He will provide for us what we need to be able to do what he's called us to do. The other thing is, what are you hesitating to give up? Christianity is a religion about sacrifice. And of course, obviously, we know Christianity is more than just a religion. It's a relationship, but it is ultimately about sacrifice. Jesus Christ said, if you'll follow me, what do you got to do? You got to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And we see throughout the scriptures, we see that kind of theme repeated in the lives of the saints. We see these saints who are willing to give up God knows what in order to follow God's commands. And there are some of us where God has given us something to do, and here we are, but we're not willing to give up maybe our comfort, maybe a certain level of income, maybe something very precious to us. Maybe we're in a bad relationship and you're not married and you're in a bad relationship. You don't want to give that up. And I don't know what it is, but there's something for us that we're unwilling to give up. Maybe there's something immoral that you indulge, your flesh enjoys, and you indulge in, and you've just kind of given yourself a pass on that, and you're just unwilling to give that up. What is it that you're unwilling to give up in order to more fully be obedient to God? I'm telling you, if you will give it up, God will show himself to you as a provider. And what he gives you in the place of that which you give up will far outweigh what you were able to give up. Now, maybe not in this life and maybe not immediately, but maybe later on down the road, you'll find your life is more impactful. You'll find your life is more meaningful if you'll just give that thing up that God is talking or speaking to you about. The other thing I want to kind of get on is this. And this is a quote from a book I've read. And here's the problem that we have a lot of times. It's sometimes we take possession of what God gave us in stewardship. You get that? We are stewards. Everything that has been given to us in this life is not ours. It is God's. It's on loan to us, and we are stewards of it. And that goes so far as not only your possessions, your money, the time you have, obviously, the children you may have, your family. You're a steward of those things. Ultimately, God is the owner of them. But let me switch that around a little bit. What in this life has taken possession of you? There are some things that have taken possession of our hearts, of our time, and they drain us of all the energy that we could be using to better serve God, to enjoy relationship with God, to enjoy relationship with God's people, to be better husbands, mothers, fathers, wives, better sons, daughters. And so sometimes it is, hey, we've taken possession of something God's given us and we don't want to let go of it. And we have a sense of ownership over it when we should understand we're just stewards of it. But sometimes those things take possession of us and we're enslaved to them and we can't let them go. And so I want you to kind of think about that. What is it that has taken possession of you? What is it that you're unwilling to let go? And this is where Abraham was. And I love the way Tozer describes this in his book on the pursuit of God. Basically, he says this, that what God was trying to do partially in one sense was remove Isaac from the throne of Abraham's heart. And he said, take your son, the one that you love. You could insert the one that thing that's taken possession of you, that thing that has taken my place. This blessing I've given you has taken my place. Take that and offer him. And there are some things that we've got to learn to offer. I remember when Brooks and I first started dating, and I really felt like that maybe God was calling, or I shouldn't say calling, but I was, just as much probably me as God, but I wanted to marry Brooks, and I wanted to ask her to marry me. And she really wanted to marry me. She wouldn't say it, but she wanted it. And she always says she knew before I did. But I told Brooks, I said, I said, I want us to take about 3 days break. I don't want us to talk to each other on the phone or text each other or anything. I said, I just got some things I want to pray about. And I think afterwards talking to her, she thought it was kind of weird and she was wondering what in the world's going on. And anyway, I took the break, and during that time, that's what I was doing. I was trying to let go because I had come to really like Brooks, love Brooks, and she had become a major part of my life, and I thank God for that. But I understood the temptation. Thank God by His grace, was able to see that it was very likely that Brooks could take possession of my heart, that in not the best way, and I needed to be able to learn to hold those things God has given me loosely. And so it was a process of about 3 days of learning to kind of let go of Brooks so that she didn't become an idol in my own heart. And so with all that said, to experience God's as provider, to experience Him as Jehovah Jireh, we must learn to obey. The other thing is we've got to learn to hold some things loosely. We got to understand we're just stewards here. And we got to be able and willing to let go of anything that comes in our lives, anything that has the potential to become an idol in our heart, anything that holds us back from fully walking in what God has called us to do. And I want to end with this. And this is, I told you we'd come back to this. When Abraham looked at this mountain and they went to this mountain and they offered Isaac, and Abraham made this declaration that this is the mount of the Lord. And he basically said, the Lord is Jehovah Jireh. He is the provider. What he was saying there, whether he realized it or not, his utterance and his act was prophetic, because they did not offer a ram or a lamb for the sacrifice. They offered a ram. And what Abraham was talking about was he's talking about a future lamb, which would be offered for the sins of the world. Because 2,000 years later, on that very spot, that very area, God the Father would actually go through with it and offer His Son, the Lamb. John the Baptist saw Jesus come and he said, what? The Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world. And God would actually go through with it and offer His Son as a burnt offering, as a sacrifice to atone for sin. And that's why in Abraham's day, or in Moses' day, when Genesis was written, it says that to this day, that place is called Jehovah Jireh. That place is called, in the mount of the Lord, it shall be seen that the Lord will provide. And I'm going to tell you, the ultimate provision is not that God provides for you materially, not that God gives you an abundance of talent or the ability to perform certain tasks. The ultimate provision is the person of Jesus Christ. That is what allows us to engage with God in relationship. And it's what allows us to know God and to find meaning and purpose in life. It's like the old, I think it's the Westminster Shorter Catechism. It says, what is the purpose or the end of man? And that is to love God and enjoy Him forever, or glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That's why we exist. And we have that ability because of the provision made by God, which was foretold by a man named Abraham, who was willing to offer his own son 2,000 years before the cross. God bless y'all. Remember, God is a provider.